Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. This time we're going to take another look at a topic that drew a very large response first time around, A Course in Miracles. Our guests are Judith Skutch and Bill Whitson. Judith is an international lecturer and formerly faculty member at New York University. She is president of the Foundation for Inner Peace, which publishes A Course in Miracles. Bill Whitson is the former chief of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Library of Congress, also former head of Asian Studies at the Rand Corporation. Bill has written several books on China and founded and formerly headed the Governor's Task Force on Earthquake Preparedness. What we want to do is talk about applications of A Course in Miracles, but before we do that, Judith, could you define what the Course is again?
Oh, yes, I can, but it's a mouthful. To sum it up, A Course in Miracles is a course one takes in order to discover one's spiritual identity. And we call it a metaphysical system for spiritual psychotherapy. In other words, it's self-administered, and it's really delving into the roots of our true identity, our nature in oneness with God.
It sounds like something that is very inner-directed, and the goals would be inner solitude and personal change, personal peace. Are there broader applications?
Well, as we change our minds about who we are, what we are, the applications are limitless, because if we think of how we define, for instance, a state of peace, we would like to say that we are in a state of inner peace, which could be the most wonderful experience we could have. If we truly are in a state of inner peace and practice I would say the rules that apply to keeping inner peace, it affects everyone we see, and it has applications beyond our belief.
Does it affect people we don't see?
Well, I believe that minds are joined, that as we are created in a non-physical form, we truly are connected. In that case, I could say that it definitely affects those we don't see, and in my life I have enough examples to prove it to me.
Bill, you've worked in some high-level foreign policy circles. Is there any application of interpersonal peace? Have you seen some of the people that are working at the highest levels affected?
Well, definitely, Charlie, and in fact in the past we have been asked to categorize miracles, little ones, as if a change of mind were only a small miracle, whereas international peace involved a big miracle. And in fact, in every case, each of these changes of mind begins very much at the personal level. In the case of, and I can give you a quick personal story.
Okay.
During the period when I was chief of the Foreign Affairs Division in the Library of Congress, and we had many congressmen and senators as our clients, clearly those men and women are under a great deal of stress every day as they confront vast issues and issues that seem to be unsolvable. And our job at the library was to try to help clarify some of these issues for them. And I had about 100 people writing analyses, and once I was called by the administrative assistant to a senator to come over because the senator was very angry. He felt that we had written something that upset him a great deal, and I was warned that he was going to be upset. Naturally, that altered my state of mind. Before I went to that office, I was already in turmoil. The fact that he was on our appropriations committee didn't help matters. And I could immediately imagine losing my job and all kinds of things that would go wrong. Then I remembered a lesson from A Course in Miracles, which had to do with simply reaching within and reminding yourself of someone you love and keeping that face in your mind throughout any interview, throughout whatever you seem to be going through. Well, I did that, and it so profoundly altered what happened next between me and the senator, who found it difficult somehow to get angry. And instead we began talking about his life in China, which was a subject I know very well. At the end of an hour, we were close friends. And I finally said to him, I know that you asked me to come over here to look at a particular problem. And he said, oh, forget that. That was never a problem in the first place. He had changed together. We had changed our minds about each other and had created our own scenario, really. And in a way, that's what A Course in Miracles is about. You make your own scenario.
That's an application from your involvement with A Course in Miracles and the impact on someone else.
Yes.
Are there people, perhaps names that we might recognize, unless it's a a secret, and I can't imagine that it would be, who are involved in some sort of a spiritual program similar to A Course in Miracles, or actually in A Course in Miracles, that we might know that are involved in international decision-making today?
Well, I was thinking of a particular instance which could be called applicable. I'm not so sure that on the radio the people who we talk about, and they haven't said in advance, go ahead and identify us, because that's such a personal path. But I can say, yes, we've seen this over and over again. Having lived in Washington, D.C., which is the seat of our government decision-making, yes, there are many people who practice this kind of a spiritual discipline. Of course, A Course in Miracles is only one form of it. But I'm thinking particularly of a man who impressed me so much when I met him, and he was an ambassador to the UN from Venezuela, Manuel Perez Guerrera. I had read an article about him in the New York Times, a whole page, one solid page, of how he was called a negotiator par excellence, because he was able to bring harmony into groups where there was disharmony to begin with. And one day I was having lunch with him at the UN, and I asked him what his reputation was based upon. And we were feeling very friendly toward each other. It was a lovely lunch, and he was a very urbane, charming, older gentleman, sophisticated, spoke many languages, very, very quiet, had a great deal of peace, I felt. And he told me that when he was a young man studying in France, he had a professor who was what was known as a metaphysician, meaning he believed that his sense of reality came from his connection with his source rather than the physical world, and that this particular professor had taught him a system of quieting whereby he would consult his inner sense and let it direct him what to do. He said, and one day, to give an example, he was sitting in a group of people where third world countries were represented, 42 of them. I guess the group had almost 100 there, and they were trying to resolve in Paris at a conference a group of issues, perhaps 24 in number. And he said they had 2 weeks in which to do this, and they had already spent 10 days at this, and not one resolution had come out of this. He said the room felt as if he was in the midst of cacophony, and he couldn't hear himself think. And then he realized that he had forgotten to practice this particular ritual that brought him peace. And so he closed his eyes while everyone was screaming and yelling at everyone else in different languages, and he centered himself, and he asked for guidance from within. And he said that very strong but small, still voice reminded him that he could open his eyes and see this room full of people in a different light. He could literally look at each one and name the person by name if he knew it, and bless them with light, and say, I love you, to himself, of course. He said he did this, and if anything, it was an exercise that gave him peace, but after about a half an hour, he noticed that the din was lower, and that people were listening to each other speak. He said, and in the quiet for a moment, he told them what he had done. And he said, we have a great deal of work here, ladies and gentlemen, to do, and only a few more days. I would suggest we each close our eyes for a few moments and consult that source within us. And perhaps from within, whatever you may call it in your own tradition, we all have it, you will be given the same direction that I've been given. And he said, indeed, they did that for a few moments, and then, to his amazement, when he opened his eyes, the room was filled, he said, with such a blinding, beautiful light, and other people must have seen it too, because they gasped. He said no one said much. There was a pause and quiet, but the rest of the day was spent in intense negotiation, and their problems were resolved by the end of that day.
Are there people in the world who, when they close their eyes and go to the inner source, find a negative force? Is evil a real force in the world?
I imagine that we all are aware that we have a voice, or sometimes it's split into many voices, that makes us feel not peaceful. It gives us unrest and it causes conflict. In the language of A Course in Miracles, that voice is called the ego. It's not the traditional psychological interpretation of the ego, but it is its own, and it defines the ego as that voice that takes our minds away from the thought of our unity with the higher, with the source, with our creator, with God. And to me, and to A Course in Miracles, the evil that we call evil is a poor choice. It comes from our own minds, and we project it outwards. So if we choose not to see peace, if we choose to see guilt, fear, anger, all the negative emotions we could possibly think of, and then project it outside onto the world, into those people we see, that in that sense is evil. We can correct the mistake, and therein lies the miracle. The miracle, as defined in A Course in Miracles, is a shift in perception that helps us see our true identity, and it is, of course, love.
Well, what about it in a historical sense? I'm really trying to. We never will resolve the issue, but it has been asked on numerous occasions. When you go back and you look at history and you look at some of the people that have played a key role in history, are there individuals? Is there an absolute evil, negative force in the world? For some great leaders, to drop a name, Hitler, was there an evil force behind this man that resulted in what we would now judge as a number of terrible, evil deeds?
Well, let me take that on for a moment, Charlie. The notion, which I believe you're reaching for, is not only some person who seems to be in the grip of and perhaps a manifestation of evil, but the objective fact of evil itself. And certainly from the viewpoint, the lenses, the vision of A Course in Miracles, there is no such thing as objective evil. Indeed, a miracle is merely a change in perception, and there is a line from A Course in Miracles which states, "The only sin is the fixed belief that perception cannot change." Thus, if you start from the viewpoint that what we believe to be, what we call reality, is simply our projection outward of an inner state of mind, then fear, or a sense of sin or guilt, becomes the source of what the world would then call evil, looking at it in the form of our institutions, of warfare, of competition, of win-lose, etc. And so certainly there have been men and women in history who perhaps were so caught in the grip not only of their own personal fears, but then the feedback they got from what they were projecting, that it took some kind of a terrible catastrophe to cleanse both outward and inward forms of fear. But objective evil is simply, and this of course is a very controversial point, we would say that objective evil is not truth, but merely a variation on a theme of countless, an infinite number of perceptions.
If then it does not exist, if this objective evil isn't really there, it's just a perception, what does the Course in Miracles prescribe for world peace?
Oh, I think we might fight over this, Charlie, who's going to take this particular question, but perhaps we'll share it. A Course in Miracles is very clear about it being a system to remind us of our spiritual nature. And I think that some of the questions we ask ourselves certainly show that we have not yet accepted this as our belief system. So how would one achieve world peace, according to A Course in Miracles? We would change our minds individually about what peace means to us. We would recognize our identity with each other. If we think of each other as the other, it is very easy to see unrest and to see, of course, anger, jealousy, all the things we can project outward on the other person. If we recognize that other person is, yes, a physical form to our eyes, but beyond what our eyes can see, that person has a spark in her, in him, that is at one with us, and we really believe that, we practice it because we've learned something different, but if we really believe it and we start to practice it, we get the effects of that, and then we see that other person is in truth ourself. If we can do that with one person and another person, it spreads very quickly. It reminds me of something that Mother Teresa, whom I met a few times and was privileged to speak with, reminded me of. I asked her how she herself felt about this issue, and she said, "My dear, spiritual deprivation is endemic in the world today. We do not know who we are and what our source is. If we would but take a moment and realize that we are at one with our Creator, we would recognize what love truly is and be able to see that other person in that state. And she said, the wonderful thing about this epidemic called fear or spiritual deprivation, the wonderful thing about it is that it can be cured by something much more powerful and something much more contagious, and that's love. And I think she's demonstrated this quite well in her life. She walks where angels fear to tread, and wars stop to allow her to take refugee children to safety because she so totally believes what she believes. I think that our great leaders were connected to that wisdom, that ancient truth, and we recognize it, and we would indeed want to follow it if it could be perfectly demonstrated to us.
Let me try a bit on that. Judy was right. I think and echo everything that she has said. I'd like to add a little bit to the approach that the Course in Miracles would imply for world peace. The Course at the very beginning states that it does not teach love because each of us inherits love. You don't teach love, but it does set out to teach the obstacles to our awareness of love's presence. And those obstacles become boundaries. They are self-imposed boundaries in our own sense of our identity. So that any boundary, whether it's a national boundary or particularly a psychological boundary which identifies one group against the other, constitutes a barrier to the achievement of world peace, which is really a state of mind that Judy was talking about. And therefore, you could say that the tactics of the Course in the achievement of world peace is simply joining. That is, when you discover a boundary, you can either fight along that boundary and make permanent almost the we-they, the other is always beyond my boundary and I must defend myself against that person or that group, or you can begin mediating and finding ways to remove the boundary. And only one example comes to mind that was perhaps most dramatic worldwide for all of us. I think when the American astronauts first walked on the moon, that night, all over the world, humans looked at it, and something had changed. If only for an instant, no matter what the national boundary was, there was a feeling that we had done that as human beings. Now, if that feeling could be made more consistent, I don't know that we can do something as dramatic as land on the moon every 6 months or 3 months, but we need to have the realization that so many of the boundaries that we put up, in a sense, to reinforce our brief moment of confidence because we have so many fears, and all of them are personal fears. If there were ways, and I think the mediators, the people who are always negotiating, the people who are trying to act as middlemen and women to bring groups together, these are the peacemakers.
I would like to interject something there if I'm allowed to, Charlie. There's a line in the Course in Miracles that's running through my mind right now, and a very quick instant to explain it. There is no more hallowed ground than that on which an ancient enemy has become a present love. There is no more hallowed ground than that on which an ancient enemy has become a present love. And I was just sitting here and looking at the TV through the window, and I can't hear it, and I was remembering the image of President Carter helping to negotiate a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And on television, a world watched two ancient enemies signing a peace treaty. And then in the form of Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, they turned to each other, and they put their arms around each other. And at that moment I wept. I don't know how many other people did, but I certainly did. And I remember that line, there is no more hallowed ground there where an ancient enemy becomes a present love. It just reverberated in my mind. We need images like that to show us which way to go.
Would it do any good? You say we need an image. Both of you have talked about a television image, which some people would debate is real. Others would say is just an image, since we really weren't able to all go and watch them walk on the moon, and we weren't all able to be at Camp David. Would it do any good for people to imagine, for example, President Reagan and Fidel Castro joining hands?
It would be wonderful to image it because our thoughts really do project. And if we can use positive images and have, for instance, a nationwide or a worldwide thought of peace, and use the image that is most colorful to you and really mean it, I do believe those things would happen.
I think another image that is perhaps just as effective and is much more, I won't say practical, but much more likely, is the image of the Quadrennial Olympics. That's a joining. We argue, we criticize that it has become too political, and yet we've read articles recently and have discovered that the ancient Greek Olympics, if possible, were even more political, that it wasn't amateurism. Yet we have somehow brought together these fine young athletes from all over the world, and for a brief instant again, we seem to set aside politics and let merit and really let the game, which I think is critical in the approach of A Course in Miracles, that if we are going to make these illusions, at least we should try to realize that while a dream, we can make these happy dreams and not tragic dreams. And in a certain sense, then, the winning at the Olympics is not just, I can recall, and all of us may recall, when our hockey team won 4 years ago. Well, the feeling around the country was not that this was just a single hockey team. There was something that was much more transcendental about that feeling.
Is there something that might be counterproductive about the competitiveness of it, though, keeping track of how many medals each country has won? Somebody is number 1, somebody is number 2, and somebody is number 3, and a whole host of countries didn't finish in the top 3, so
Yes.
They are somehow lesser.
Yes, I think that one can accent, because there's always duality. There's always positive and negative. And in anything that you see the positive in, your ego and fear can turn right around. And in fact, I think to the extent that we need to measure, this is very much of an ego activity. I'm 1, I'm 2, I won, we won. All of that is, but you can pull the sting of that if you accent the process, if you accent that what was really happening when teams were competing was something far deeper than what seemed to be the outcome. And the outcome momentarily is a win or a lose, a place. But when you talk with the athletes and they've played against an opposing team, there is a kind of love that is going on, that's being expressed there. And that's even true in warfare. Many people would say, well, I don't know how much love there was in a great battle. And yet you find among honorable adversaries a feeling of joining that goes very deep.
Judith, what's happening with the Course in Miracles outside the United States? We've mentioned some examples of how it might be affecting American foreign policy and other foreign policies in Washington, D.C., but what about in other geographical areas around the globe?
Well, Charlie, it's an interesting question because it seems to have a process of its own. And again, I hasten to add, it isn't that A Course in Miracles, 3 books that comprise the self-study course we're discussing, is going to change the world, but rather the ideas therein. And the ideas therein are just the ancient wisdoms of the perennial philosophy that we all seem to believe in, no matter where we're living on the earth. However, as far as A Course in Miracles itself is concerned, it's now being translated into 7 languages. And I say it has a process of its own also because no one ever thought that this mammoth study course could be translated, and yet individuals in other countries have had it in English passed to them by friends, or they heard about it who knows where, and they feel that they would like to share it with their country people. So right now the ongoing translations are Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Hebrew, German, and Russian. And that seems to me to be kind of remarkable. Now, who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years as these editions start to be disseminated in the various countries. I guess it'll just remind people once again of their path and who they are and where they want to go.
And I should add, Charlie, that as part of this translation, there is an 8th language, and that is computer language. The course has now been put completely on computer. And then you could say there's a ninth because the Foundation for Inner Peace has produced 2 television cassettes, one on how the Course really came, what happened there, what the history of its development was, and the second on what it says, a very brief outline by Dr. Kenneth Wapnick on just what is in the Course.
There are some who might suggest, those of us who are regular listeners of Infinity and have been exposed to all kinds of ideas, that A Course in Miracles is one segment of something much larger that is happening. And in many instances, it's the rediscovery of ancient traditions and ancient spiritual patterns.
I think that's probably right, Charlie. We seem to know who we are at some level, and whatever it is that's going to help us uncover the many onion skins to that core where we have our identity is going to be helpful. But I do think A Course in Miracles is of a much greater plan, and it's only one very small piece of it. Thank goodness there are many other forms too that are going on.
Why is it, and I'm thinking in a political context here, that so often when spiritualism is involved in the political process, particularly the American political process, that it ends up being some kind of a conflict? Somebody is holier than thou, to take an old expression, but morality and spiritualism become, instead of a unifying force, a dividing force. Allegations are made on both sides, and the public perception often is that neither individual or neither cause is really clean.
Well, I think we make mistakes, and we make many of them, and somehow or other it's up to us collectively and individually to correct them. But I know exactly what you're saying certainly has seemed to be true in the past. Perhaps we can look at those mistakes and choose a different form this time. Perhaps those individuals who happen to arrive at a place of prominence and visibility can have the strength within themselves, if they do believe their spiritual nature, of just demonstrating it and not talking about it. And if the demonstration is indeed a true one, that's much more powerful than any rhetoric.
And I think also, as Charlie's question reflects, religious wars have been the most ruthless and barbaric and bloody wars in history. And so the question, in a larger sense, is why? What is it that happens that makes such wars and such confrontations, whether in domestic or international politics, so confrontational? And I think the issue is, again, the ego. That is, the ego says, I speak to God. The way I speak to God is the correct way, and you don't speak to God correctly, and don't threaten. You're threatening something much deeper than my purse or my possessions when you threaten what I know is true. And so again, you have levels and levels of so-called spirituality, but in fact, again, separation, boundaries, and competition.
As time runs out for us on the program, is there time left for the world to accomplish all of these things? We're going in the right direction, but is there time?
I have to say once more, Charlie, that there's a line from A Course in Miracles that I must close with, and it's, seek not to change the world, but change instead your mind about it, and you will find peace.
And so will the world.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.